Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to have our guests here today. Glad to see the Hoosers here, and Juanita's back, and Chad, good to see you guys here today. Appreciated Mr. Barnett's message this morning, and even some of the announcements that Mr. Robinson gave. Aside from the sermon, I just might mention I was talking with some patients this week. I see patients that work in all different sorts of health care, multiple patients. I never see a medical doctor, never, but I see tons of nurses. I see lots and lots of nurses that don't want to take medicine and would rather, find something other than medicine to relieve their pain. But nevertheless, I was talking to a social worker. No. Yes, I'm sorry. Somebody who works for, what's the word I'm looking for? Child Protective Services. And, of course, they had been reporting that the number of abuse cases were way down, and they were a lot slower. And I asked why that was, and they said because most of the reports come in from teachers, so they don't hear a lot of the things that are going on at homes. So this is one of the unintended consequences of central planning, that people don't understand, that there are other aspects of the human factors, human lives that are affected. I talked to somebody who works in a psychological counseling unit in Columbia, and I said, "How's everything going?" She said, "Oh, we are swamped. We're just swamped." I said, "What is it? Is it because of depression?" She said, "Oh yeah, people are very depressed. They have lots of anxiety, a lot of suicidal thoughts and tendencies. So they're just swamped over there at their practice." So these are some of the things that go on in society when a government decides that they know what's best for you. They don't understand all the implications of your life, all the side aspects. They don't get everything. You can go read the old essay called "I Pencil," which is a great essay, and it explains very, very well on how a central planning government could not create a pencil, because there are so many working parts and so many parts of an economy that come together to put a pencil together without going out of business. And all these players come together to create this little tiny pencil that costs what? 5 cents? 6 cents? This little tiny pencil. But no way could a government do this. It takes individuals to do this. I'll talk about some of this in my sermon today. And we have plenty of time. Lots of time to go through some stuff. But I won't. I've got a lot to say, but I want to work on one aspect today. I want to work on one part of this topic today, which I think is so important. So there's a battle taking place in this world today. There's a big battle. And this battle seems to be political. This battle seems to be non-religious. And it seems to us, many people, that this battle has nothing to do with us. But we would be wrong. There's a battle taking place today in this world, and it's a battle for ideas. It's a battle for our minds. It's a battle for our beliefs. And it's a battle that's been taking place for, well, you could go back to the Garden of Eden. And that would be, another sermon to deal with how this thing goes all the way back and traces back to the Garden of Eden. But the battle of ideas that I want to talk about today is the utopian battle of Marxism. The utopian battle of Marxism. Now, you may think to yourself, oh, Marxism, that's just a political topic. Why do we want to talk about political themes in a religious service? Well, I want you to stay with me, and I'll show you that it's not. This is not political, except, or maybe you could say everything is political in some sense, because political ideas concern government, and we are concerned about government. So let me just go to Mark chapter 10, if you would turn to Mark chapter 10, and I want to use this one section here to bring out this one small sliver of an idea, if I could, in Mark chapter 10. And I'm only going to touch on just a little aspect of this, and I'm not going to have time to go through this in detail. I have a longer exposition on this particular section on the web if you want to go up and pull down a sermon that I gave on blind Bartimaeus. You can do that. It gives me a lot more detail. But I just want to use this right here, for time's sake, to lead into this message. Mark chapter 10 and verse 46. It says, "And he," that is Christ, "went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people. Blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the highway side begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many charged him that he should hold his peace. But he cried out more a great deal, 'Thou Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. And so they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Be of good comfort, rise, he calls you.' And he, casting away his garment, rose and came to Jesus. And Jesus answered and said unto him, 'What will you do, or what do you want me to do unto you?' And the blind man said to the Lord, that I might receive my sight. And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way, your faith has made you whole.' And immediately he received his sight, and he followed Jesus in the way." Now this is an interesting passage of Scripture here, that Jesus Christ, in what I see here, is that he recognized the individuality of this man as no one had ever done before. The disciples, or whoever was with him, wanted him to be silent. But Jesus wanted him to speak. He wanted to know what he had to say. I want you to notice that this man here didn't have a name. You may think he has a name. You may think his name is Bartimaeus. But that just means the son of Timaeus. So this man was nameless. A nameless man sitting on the highway begging. People pass by, maybe throw something in his cup, maybe not. An unrecognizable person in name to anyone else, except for that he was the son of Timaeus. But Jesus recognized this man for who he was, an individual who sought forgiveness and had faith, not the faith of his father. And a lot of times we tie ourselves to our ancestors in a way that's not healthy. But Jesus has pulled him out, and he says, your faith, what he recognized in him, what Jesus recognized, your faith has made you whole. And this is important to understand as we move forward, because the system of Marxism, and you could say socialism, does not recognize individuality. This is a core component, a core tenet of the ism. It only sees the common good, and that through the eyes of statism that decides what the common good is. So this begs the question, how do political systems and types of government pertain to us as Christians? And does it matter? Does the Scripture not say that we are to be kings and priests? Are we not to have rulership? And if we're to be kings or we're to be priests, how are you going to rule? That in and of itself is political. Government systems, how you pertain to government, how government runs systems is political. Now, I've heard perhaps maybe a sermon or two over the years that I grew up in the church on, and maybe just a couple, on the type of political system and economy that would be set up in the kingdom of God. And maybe you've heard one, or maybe you've heard none. I don't know. I've heard many sermons on the righteousness of Christ. Now, how would you base the righteousness of Christ? And that He is good. Every law emanates from Him. That's political, because laws run countries. I've heard sermons on how He'll rule with fairness and equity. And you can go through the book of the law, and you can see all the different laws set up for Israel at that time, how the country was to be run, how our lives are to be run. I've heard sermons on the economic abundance in the kingdom, how there will be an amazing abundance economically. But how? How will the system be set up? And how will it work? Again, you can go back to the Old Testament and you can look at all the laws that God gave to Israel, how they were set to set up their system of government. And you can say, well, that is probably most likely. I'm not here to tell you how it's going to be set up today. Perhaps that's another topic at a later time. But all those laws, the statutes, the judgments, they are inherently political by nature. And that was the political system that God himself set up. So there is an importance to the inclusion of political discourse in a spiritual or religious forum. It's really impossible to untangle the two. I don't know how it's even possible. How do you do it? What I'm going to tell you today is what type of system, rather, we will not see in the millennium. And I feel confident of this. What we will not see in the millennium. Back in Mark chapter 10, there's an important point about the individuality of man. Individualism assumes there is an important potential and utility for man. It assumes a sacredness to human life. Other religions, such as Hinduism, for instance, you can go back to the Eastern mystical religions, Buddhism, they relegate to man to something that they call an anat man. They come to that point, an anat man, which means it's a nothingness. That's what it is. It's a blowing away of the seeds to the flower to achieve a state of nirvana. And you've all heard about nirvana, where the body basically, for better of words, choice of words, evaporates and becomes lost to the transcendence of the universe. You're sort of melded into the universal code, I guess, as it were. There's no unique you. There's no great purpose for you individually. Even in the religion of atheism, one comes to nothing. You are simply absorbed back into the ground, and you are nothing but blood and soil, ready to fertilize the next round of grass and trees. But in Christianity, brethren, there is the overt declaration of individuality, but also that of property acquisition. What does God say in Revelation chapter 21, verse 7? I'll just reference this, 21, verse 7. He says, "He that overcomes shall inherit" what? All things. He shall inherit. This is property acquisition. He's speaking of property rights here, that an individual will inherit some tangible thing. I'd like you to look over to Micah chapter 4. Micah chapter 4. Because we're going to see something that is a reflection or a looking forward, a prophetic event that will occur in the millennium. And there's a very important point here that you cannot skip over. It's something we've heard for years and years, but there's a subpoint here that you have to understand the problems with Marxism or socialism. Micah 4, in chapter 4 and verse 4 says this, "Every man shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid." There's a lot here, really, and just in this one scripture. In context, Micah was talking about nations beating their swords into plowshares. Man wouldn't become afraid anymore, wouldn't be afraid of some nation, right? Because none shall be afraid, coming in and taking away their freedoms, taking away their property, their rights, their lives, their liberty. And every man shall sit under what? His own vine and his own fig tree. That's ownership. That's property rights. Do you know the very first thing that Marxism seeks to destroy in a community? It's property. They despise individual property rights. Everything belongs to the collective good, to the collected. Property then is not considered important to them. So when you see some of these riots going on today and the looting and the protests, you need to know that property means nothing to them. That's why they destroy it, because it's not really yours. You took it, and it belongs to everyone. So when they destroy property, it has no meaning. There's no ethic, there's no value to them. It's not owned by you. It's the collective ownership. Private property, on the other hand, can only be a reality in an economic system that recognizes the importance and the uniqueness of the individual, not in a system that steals a person's individualism and collectivizes them into a large group. It was many years ago, I had an individual who worked for me, and the question came this way. We were talking. He said it would be much easier and society would not have as many problems as they have if everybody was just paid the same amount. across the board. If everybody just paid the same, everything would be much easier. We wouldn't have all this fighting and you know, this problems with housing and all this stuff that we have. The inequalities, the way that he saw it. And I knew why he said this, because this particular individual was just simply unwilling to put in the hard work. I knew him pretty well. He was unwilling to do it. He was unwilling to do the things that he needed to do to increase the money that he earned, the money that he wanted, the money that other people had, the money that he was jealous of. And of course I told him, I don't know how that would ever work. Why would some of the brightest minds spend 8 years in medical school? 4 years in undergrad, 4 years in medical school, 3 years in residency, 2 years in subspecialty. Why would they spend all of that time giving up their whole lives, working 70 hours a week, being on rotations, for all that time, giving up the things that, in his case, what you have a boat, they don't have one. You have a nice house, they don't have one. They live in a small apartment so they can pay for their schooling, for their housing, for their clothing. I remember going into a house one time of a guy who was going to chiropractic school after I came out of AC, and he was living in this little apartment on the floor. His bed was on the floor, and that was a wake-up call to me to say, what kind of sacrifices was he willing to make to get what he wanted? And it drove something home to me, so that when I eventually went on to college, I lived in a little studio apartment. I didn't have a bed. I slept on a bean bag, or I slept in a sleeping bag. I didn't have a bed. Those are the things that you give up to try and seek something later, that you're delaying gratification for a payoff at the end. So he wasn't willing to do any of these things. That's a fundamental problem in that thinking, that you want what others have, but you're not willing to give up the price. It's the saying that says, it's the thinking, I should say, that says, Walmart makes too much money. They are too rich. Oil companies are greedy. Wall Street executives should never get a bonus, even in a down economy. Never. Or even if someone says, your prices are outrageous. If you don't like the prices, go somewhere else. You can do that in a free economy. You can't do that in an economy where it's set by the central government. So let me ask you the question, brethren. What starts wars? What starts wars? What started World War I, the Gulf War, Falkland Island War, World War II, Vietnam? What starts any wars? I want you to look at James chapter 4 with me. James chapter 4 uses this illustration to make a point about us as individuals. And I want you to notice what he says here in James chapter 4. We'll read through a few verses here. But he starts off in verse 1 of chapter 4 here in the book of James. From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence, even of your lusts that war in your members? So outward war is what he's saying here, and fighting is simply an expression of war and fighting within ourselves. That's where it all begins. We're fighting against the law. And when our fight with the law within ourselves, when we do that, and it spills out, then we have problems. We have issues. The manifestation of that battle is war, or the actions of lust, the actions of killing, or desiring that which we don't have, that which is not ours. This is where wars come from. It starts here. It starts in the individual. Or it's in the simple expression, they make too much money. You're warring within yourself. This is an interesting section of Scripture when we place it vis-a-vis with socialism. Here's what Jacob Hornsberger wrote in an article entitled, 4 Arguments Against Socialism, Including Medicare. He said this: Socialism turns into a war in which everyone is doing his best to get into everyone else's pocketbook, while doing everything he can to protect his own pocketbook from being plundered. As Frederick Bastiat put it so well, under socialism, the government becomes a great fiction by which everyone is trying to live at the expense of everyone else. How can a society survive when everyone is warring against everyone else? End quote. That's quite a statement. This can be a difficult thing sometimes to get our minds around, but this is what God is talking about. Look at verse 2 of James 4. You lust and you have not. You kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. You fight in war and yet you have not because you ask not. You ask and you receive not because you ask amiss, and you may consume it upon your lusts. You adulterers and adulteresses. And this right here is simply another manifestation of the inward battle against the law when we take another's that is not lawfully ours. We not only covet that which is not ours, this is another husband or a wife, we covet that which isn't ours. We steal another's that belongs to them, and then we commit adultery while committing murder through the spirit of hate. All of these things happen when we're talking about committing adultery. We can only serve one master. That's it, one master. You know, we'll hate, if we try to serve two, we'll hate one and love the other. I mean, you just think about Jacob. He hated Leah by comparison, and he loved Rachel. So we covet, we steal, and kill even as adulterers. So what does God show us here? Know you not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. And so these actions and attitudes are in line with the way of the world, of lust and greed and hatred and stealing and murder and killing, of wanting something that someone has that's not yours. They're in line with the way of Satan. Verse 5 ties it together. Do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit that dwells in us lusts to envy? It's not in vain that it says that. This is what ties together. This envy, this lust ties it all together. All of this happens from there. Now let's go to the source. Let's go to Exodus chapter 20. And you probably all know these very well, but I want you to see them as we read them. Here is the Ten Commandments that God spoke to Moses to give to Israel, the code of conduct to live by and everything that flows from them, which comes from the very character of God himself. Exodus chapter 20, and look at verse 13. You shall not kill. Verse 14, you shall not commit adultery. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is your neighbor's. You know the one commandment of all the commandments, not just this, but all of them, that has no literal letter that can be transgressed is number 10. It's the last commandment. How do you physically covet something? How is it possible to do that? Coveting takes place actually only in the mind, not by action. It's spiritual in nature. And it is the commandment that James was discussing. Lusting or coveting that which is not ours leads one to take that which does not belong to us. That's the whole social doctrine of socialism, of Marxism. There is an underlying assumption to what James is saying and to what the commandments are stating. That is, in order for something to be coveted, in order for something to be stolen, in order for killing and adultery to be wrong, there is the idea or the concept of ownership, and that of individuality underpinning that ownership. This is why Marxism is against it. It steals the individuality. It says there is no ownership of the individual. If that's the case, there are no commandments to break. In other words, collectivism is not ownership or property rights. The Statue of Liberty does not belong to the people of America. If it did, then I would own 1/300 millionth of it. And I could go there and I could choose my little chip off of that statue and I could take it home. Now, if I did that today, I would be thrown in federal prison for 10 years. There were laws before that. You can't disrupt or take apart federal property. I don't own any of it. I don't own the Statue of Liberty, and neither do you. Most of you, however, own your own home, and I'm told not to covet that home. That's your ownership. You own it. I'm told not to covet your wife. That's ownership. She's yours. You're not to covet someone's husband. That's ownership. 1 Corinthians 7:4 says this is ownership. The wife has not power of her own, but the husband, and likewise also the husband has not power over his own body, but the wife. I'm told in Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 1, not to covet your ox or your ass. And by extension, it could be your car. It could be your lawnmower. It could be anything like that that does work for you. I can't covet any of that stuff. You shall not see your brother's ox or sheep go astray and hide yourself from them. You shall, in any case, bring them unto your brother. And you have to be concerned about the ownership of that belongs to someone else. So if you drive down the road and you see an ox in the ditch, it's your responsibility to find out whose that belongs to and return it. If a lawnmower starts running across my yard by itself, I have a responsibility to try and figure out whose that lawnmower belongs to and return it. So I'm told not to covet any of that. I'm told not to covet anything that's yours. And if so, it can lead to stealing. And that is an assumption of ownership. It could lead to killing. Killing yourself even. But you are owned. You are owned by someone. You're owned by your spouse. You're owned by God. It was interesting that Jean Paul Sartre, who was a communist, who recanted on his deathbed, but he said one time that committing suicide would be using his freedom to take away his freedom. Now that's interesting coming from a man who was an avowed communist. But you are owned. And as I said, committing adultery assumes ownership. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. It assumes ownership as well. 1 Corinthians 6 verse 18. We'll read 18 and 19. It says, flee fornication. Every sin that a man does is without his body, but he that commits fornication sins against his own body. What? Don't you know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit which is in you, which you have of God, that you are not your own? You are owned. So what I'm showing you, brethren, is that in God's most basic instructions to us, there is the underlying assumption of ownership. And without that understood assumption, then not only do God's instructions to us make no sense, but the commandments themselves make absolutely no sense whatsoever. So is this political? Let me take what I said back earlier. Yes, this is political. This is a political topic because politics relates to government. And there is the government of self. How do you relate to yourself in controlling the lust within you? Paul talks about this, the government of self. It's a political topic. The government of self, the governments of this world. Under the system of communism, fascism, socialism, there is a loss of property rights and ownership take over from the government and power. And our Constitution, frankly, had it right when the Founding Fathers wrote that there were certain unalienable rights bestowed upon us by our Creator. And when Jefferson wrote this, he took this from Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher of the 1600s, which said, among these were life, liberty, and now Jefferson wrote the pursuit of happiness, but Locke said this. He said property. Actually, the original Declaration said property. Life, liberty, and property. Those are the things that are unalienable rights. Where did John Locke get it from? He got it from the Scriptures. But these rights come with conditions. The condition that we abide by the codified words of the Ten Commandments. And that is to be our governor. That is what we use as a self-government. It governs everything that we do. Our freedom exists within the confines of those words in Exodus. The children of Israel, however, were unable to abide by these directives, and during the time of the judges, there was no king. And I'm not even sure they saw God as their king at that time. God sent judges to them, and they didn't really listen to them. And so it was a time when it says that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And so because Israel was not able to govern themselves, they wanted someone to govern them. And in doing so, they rejected God. They wanted a king. You see, this was not what God wanted. God didn't want them to have a king. He wanted him to be their king. That's what he wanted, but he knew this was the way Israel would go. And so look at 1 Samuel chapter 8, and let's see how this went. So they say, I want a king. He says, no, you don't want a king. Yes, we want a king. Okay, here's what's going to happen when you get a king. Not that it's right, but this is what's going to happen. 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5. And he said to them, Behold, you are old, and your sons walk not in your ways. This is Samuel. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken to the voice of the people and all that they have to say to you. For they've not rejected you, but they've rejected me, that I would not reign over them. Now notice what God told them would happen once they had a human king rule over them in verse 11. And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, captains over 50s, and he will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters, in verse 13, to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to your servants, or to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed, and your vineyards, and give them to his officers, and to his servants. And he will take your men servants, and your maidservants, and your goodliest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. And he will take a tenth of your sheep, and you shall be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, which you shall have not chosen you, and the Lord will not hear it in that day. Nevertheless, after hearing all of this, the people said, no, we want to have a king over us. Boy, if they only took 10% from us today for taxes. You know, we didn't have income taxes at the start of this country. They were illegal. They were against the Constitution. I think it was Article 2, I believe. And then they made the 16th Amendment to try and make them legal. There's some debate whether they did it or not. But they take. So what happens here? Right? Murder, theft, coveting, and lust. These are all the commandments the king was going to transgress. All the ways that the king would seize their freedom from them. God warned them, but they would have none of it. They wanted a king. But as we heard last week, when Mr. Robinson was talking, the early pioneers, when they came to this country, the new world from the old world of England and the Dutchland, they were escaping the monarchy. And they said, when they came to the new world, Christ was going to be their king. Christ is our king. They weren't going to be ruled by anyone else, because they understood that absolute power was something that could only be trusted to the hands of God. And since rights came directly from God to the individual, not the collective, that when power was given to others over them, things would go bad. And so they said, we want to keep it close. So if we're going to elect somebody to have representation over us, we want it to be very close to us. So that's why they had representatives from the states, right, based on the apportionment of the number of people, and they had senators. The power was not in the federal government. The power was close to them in the states, so that they had control over what they wanted, and not some faraway monarch or dictator that would steal their rights and freedoms from them for their own gain. So now we see a new, I don't know if it's iteration, we see a new iteration of the old plan that Satan had put forth in the Garden of Eden come up under communism. Communism isn't some new thing, brethren. It was put in a new form, but it's not some new thing. The socialist experiment of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, would go awry. And I want to talk just about that for a minute. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche foresaw this when he proclaimed the death of God in the 19th century. Oh, it was supposed to be a grand time, a wonderful time when all of the, all the rights or all the wrongs would be made right. It was a time of renewal, a heavenly time now that man was freed from the bonds of an angry God. Nietzsche talked about the death of God. It was an age that was supposed to usher in a utopia. H.G. Wells and others were leaders of this Romantic era. That was what the Romantic era was all about. It was about a social utopia where all the wrongs would be made right, the proletariat would finally be crushed, would finally crush the strangleholds of the bourgeois, or in today's terms, the labor class, and you see that in Britain, the labor class would equalize with the production class. The problem is, communism and socialism are predicated upon breaking the 8th and the 10th commandment. It is foundational to the system. It is anti-God. It is anti-everything about God, stealing and coveting. For it's the wholesale coveting of another's possession that leads one into class warfare. And that's what it is. Identity politics and class warfare leads to this destruction. Their house is too big. They make too much money. The wage gap is too large. They have too much land. They have better food than us. They have more oil than us. They have more natural resources than us. They have too many employees. And on it goes in that class warfare. So in order for the coveters to reset the system and level the playing field in their mind, they pass laws to take and to steal and redistribute the wealth to others. And this happens under socialism or progressivism. And left unchecked, it continues on to communism. As Karl Marx himself said, he said socialism is just a pit stop between capitalism and communism. But Nietzsche saw it. Nietzsche saw it. He said that the 20th century would go on to become the bloodiest century of mankind due to the death of God. And I'll add to that, with him, that with the death of God, the death of morality. Because when you don't have an absolute lawgiver, you have no absolute law to tie your moral ethic to, which means that your moral ethic can change from day to day. What's right yesterday is not right today, and what is right today will not be right tomorrow. The statue that was put up 100 years ago is not a statue that should be put up today. You see it in society all the time happening. During the Romantic time, the famous playwright George Bernard Shaw said this, and I want to tell you just briefly about George Bernard Shaw. He was a founder of the Fabian Socialist Society in Britain. He had a major influence on this world as far as socialism goes, and he was a major player in the founding of the Labour Party in the British government as well. But he said this, this was a view of his utopian philosophy and how to achieve it. He said, "I don't want to punish anybody, but there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board, just as he might come before the income tax commissioners and say every 5 years or every 7 years, and just put them there and say, 'Sir or Madame, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of much use to yourself.'" Staggering, isn't it? We can talk about the offshoots of that later. But it assumes that the collectivism of the state supersedes the individuality of the person. Do you see that in the statement? That your right to life comes from whom? It comes from the state. It does not come from God. That you are simply a pawn that's used by the state for its own ends. He also said this. He said, "I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly. In short, a gentlemanly gas. Deadly by all means, but humane, not cruel." And then he went on to say, "We should do it while we play lovely classical music as we march them off into the gas chambers." Well, this was before Nazism. How ungodly, how despicable, how satanic. And this is socialism and communism's origin. Satan was the first communist, brethren. Isaiah chapter 14, I want you to look over here in Isaiah 14. It starts with him and it ends with him. He was the first to covet, and I want you to see that in Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapter 14, and look at verse 12. Verse 12. How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How are you cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? Now, how did he weaken the nations? How did he do this? Well, he did it through his spirit of coveting and lust. You go back to James, and you can see how this happens. James wrote, where do wars come from? From lusts within your members, warring against the law. This is how he weakens nations. He gets them to covet and to take and to steal and subvert their rights, their liberties, their freedoms of its people and others. What happened in Venezuela and Cuba with Chavez and Castro? You know what they did? They ran out the rich. They ran out the people who actually knew how to run the country to produce something, to give the people a job. They ran them out of the country because they were considered evil for their exploitation of the proletariat, of what they call the proletariat, the lower class. They took control of the media, which were the outlets of free thought and free speech, and they ran that, and they took control of the banks, and that means they controlled the means of investment. And they coveted what was others, and they stole it for themselves. Look at verse 13. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. So what did Satan do? The same way that he coveted the throne of God and wanted to steal it for himself is the method he uses on governments and people to weaken nations. You know, in Russia, Stalin forced peasants to give up their farms under the banner of collectivism for the greater good. Peasants are the army of nationalism. They get in the way, and so you have to crush them, he said. Viktor Yushchenko was the Ukraine president back at this time during the Great Potato Famine. They call it this, but it wasn't. They had plenty of food in Ukraine. This was a government-created mass starvation. But he said this. He said, my wife's grandfather died in 1933. He was arrested for, actually this is, I'm sorry, Yushchenko was much later. I'm getting confused here. He's much earlier. He was arrested for refusal to join the collective farm. While he was in prison, his wife was forced to divorce him. When he returned from prison, he saw that he had no wife, he could not see his children, he had no house, and he had no land. There are millions of such stories, he said. It was called a holodomor, murder by hunger. Yushchenko said death from hunger was not unusual in the 20th century, but there's a difference between death by hunger and murder by hunger. Stalin took their food and he plunged them into famine. Grain was in abundance, but they were exporting it to fund their centrally planned industrialization. The Kremlin denied that there was a famine and had the liberal American press on their side. Chief among them was Walter Duranty, who wrote for the New York Times. Walter Duranty called the forced famine in the Ukraine mostly bunk. He was actually given a nice flat in Russia, given a mistress, lots of money, and did their bidding pretty much. In a column entitled Russians Hungry but Not Starving, he wrote, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. There was a real draw amongst the elites in America towards what Russia was doing. And whether or not they understood what was going on, I don't know. But the story was not getting out. Nobody knew how many millions of people were dying in Ukraine because of what Russia was doing to their own people, trying to build up their state by taking all of their stuff. Finally, it was Malcolm Muggeridge who eventually got 3 stories smuggled out of Russia. And they were heavily edited, but they were published in the Manchester Guardian, who got the story out about what was going on in Ukraine at the time. And we just had something in the E-News about Mr. Kubik's parents fleeing from this very thing in Ukraine. Nikolai Melnik, a survivor, said this. He said, "They entered a house and asked, 'Where are your dead?' There was only a half-dead woman laying in the bed, and they said, 'Well, let's take her. She's going to die anyway. Why come after her tomorrow?' She begged them, 'Do not take me. I'm alive. I want to live.' Maria Zagitz, a survivor, said it was horrible. They were all dumped into a grave. The ground was moving." And then next to Russia, in China a little bit later, from 1959 to 1961, there was what was called the Great Leap Forward in China under Mao Zedong. It was a time when he tried to collectivize and communize agriculture. His people came to him the first year of his plan and they said, "Chairman Mao, 5 million people have died of famine." And he said, "No matter, keep going." The second year they came to him and they said, 10 million Chinese have died. And he said, "No matter, just continue." The third year, 20 million Chinese had died. And he finally said, "Well, perhaps this wasn't the best idea I had." When he was told that his people were dying of starvation, Mao said, "Educate the peasants to eat less. Death has benefits. They can fertilize the land." The Black Book of Communism, published by the Harvard University Press, said that over 100 million people died under the rule of communism in the 20th century. And I think that is a gross understatement. It's probably double that or more. At the direct hands of communist rule. That's a staggering number, brethren. Not that lived under it, but died under it. They stamped out anyone that got in their way of their objective. Under collectivism, communism, socialism, there is no God, there are no morals, there is no ownership, there is no individuality, there is no freedom, no liberty, and there is no economic abundance. David Horowitz was a former communist, and he wrote this. He said, "Conservatives guide everything they do by looking at the past, the experience, that is what human beings are. This is the way they behave. This is the limits of what you can hope for with these people. Progressives govern everything from the future. They have this imaginary future, which is an ideal world of social justice, and they judge everything by that future." Can you see that happening now? You see it happening right today. The destruction of artwork, the destruction of statues. Everything's by the future. That's why we're in year zero. Every year is a year zero. The cancel culture cancels everything. It's a description of what we see today. The past is not judged in its context at all. It's judged by the future. Oh, how we can be thankful that God does not do that, or else how could we hold up any biblical character? How can you hold up Noah, knowing what he did after the flood? How could you hold up Abraham, knowing what he did with his wife? How could you hold up David, knowing all the problems he had with his family and the killing of Uriah? Or Solomon and all the things that he did, or even the apostles knowing what they did. All the stories are there. How can you hold any of them up when you judge by the future? Let's go back to Mark chapter 10 again, where we began, so I can give you a couple thoughts and wrap this up. I've read many times over the years, and you can find it today everywhere on the internet, that Christ advocated a communist philosophy and that capitalism ignores the poor and rewards the greedy. In fact, I went online the other day because I had taken this test years ago, and the question was, are you a socialist or are you a capitalist? And when you go through the questions, they'll tell you what you are based on how you answer the questions. So there's more to the questions than just whether you believe the government should be the means of production. Right? There were questions like this. If you have a party and you invite people over, do you tell everybody you're having a potluck? Do you say, since I invited everybody, I'll pay for everything? Or do you say, I don't eat at a party, I just drink? Based on how you answer that question determines whether you're a socialist or capitalist. If you go by somebody in the street and you see a homeless person, do you, A, stop and give them some money because you feel sorry for them? Do you pass them by thinking they're in that position because something they did? Or C, I don't remember what it was, something else. If you did one thing, you were a socialist. If you did another thing, you're a capitalist. A fake dichotomy. So the idea today is that if you are willing to, if you're willing to give up of your time and your money, right, and you are generous with those things, then you're a socialist. You're not a capitalist. It's the big lie that we all have been, has all been put on us today. If you have a chance, go take the test. It's interesting, the way that they're going to peg you, which isn't necessarily true. But look at the story that has blind Bartimaeus, and look what it shows us. Christ shows us in this passage the compassion that we should have for those indigent who cannot help themselves. Brethren, when we assume that the government takes our money and redistributes it to this man and others like him, we are compelled to walk by him. We are compelled to walk by him. Let me say that again. When we assume that the government takes our money and redistributes it to others who have physical needs, we are compelled to walk by them. You see, there's no place for a good Samaritan under a socialist agenda. There's no brother's keeper either, because the welfare nanny state now becomes the good Samaritan. Not you. They've stripped it from us. They've stolen our ability to help those in time of need. Our best way to help under that government is to point the person to the government office so that they can help them. And it's sad that we've come to that point. Because they've taken so much from us, it's difficult sometimes to help people in what we have. Now, we still need to do our best to do that. But it's all upside down compared to God's economy. Grover Cleveland was the 24th and the 22nd President of the United States. He was a Democrat, but he believed in keeping government expenditures at the minimum required to carry out essential constitutional functions. He said that when a man in office lays out $1 in extravagance, he acts immorally by the people. I don't think we think much of Grover Cleveland necessarily. I don't know all the things that he believed, but I do like this one thing, and I want to read this to you. In 1887, a bill came to his desk that appropriated $10,000 for a Texas seed bill to help the farmers that had been affected by a terrible drought. It would allow the Commissioner of Agriculture to purchase seed grain for distribution to farmers in certain counties of Texas that had suffered from drought. The President's veto message reads in part as follows. This is what it said. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and the duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. Let me stop there. In this particular point in time, the government can find anything and everything for the public benefit. There is nothing that they will not say is for the common good. That's not the way Grover Cleveland saw it. He goes on to say, a prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadily resisted, to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people. Cleveland went on to point out that the friendliness and charity of our countrymen can always be relied on to relieve their fellow citizens in misfortune. And indeed, that individual aid has come to some extent already, been extended, to some extent already has been extended to the sufferers mentioned in this bill. He went on to say other things, but as it turned out, Cleveland was right. I think they had apportioned $10,000, I think I read, to this alleviation of suffering for these Texas grain farmers. And what had happened was when their own countrymen came to their aid, I think they donated somewhere around 10 times the amount that the government was going to give to them. This is their own people. Everything local, right? This is the people that were able to help them. They knew them. They knew what was going on. They knew they really needed it, rather than somebody far, far away. Cleveland kept at bay communist tendencies. I want to read to you something that I had just read yesterday. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm just going to tell you about it. But this was an article I read about Yuri Bezmenov. I don't know if you've seen this. Came out a couple days ago. But Yuri Bezmenov was a Russian propagandist who gave an interview several years ago. And man, this might have been back in 1984, quite a number of years ago. And he said this. He said there were 4 stages of a Marxist takeover. Take note. This is how he said they would do it. It was Khrushchev. Khrushchev had said, Russia didn't have to shoot a single rocket or shoot a single gun to take over America. They didn't have to do it. They were going to do it from within by Russian propaganda. They were going to take over the country internally. So this was their 4-step stage of takeover by the Marxists from Marxism. The first step was demoralization. Demoralize the people of the country so that they feel like that there's nothing they can do and there's no way out. The second step was destabilization, which means now you have a crisis. You have things that are set up in the society where things are destabilized now, and you almost feel like you're out of control. So you go through a demoralization process or step, you go through a destabilization step, and then the third step is crisis. There is a crisis in the country, and it needs help. Somebody needs to step in and do something about it. And when the crisis is over, you have what's called normalization, or you have a new normal. Because people have now accepted what is going on, and they don't feel demoralized anymore until you devolve this 4-step process until you finally have revolution to the point where the country is taken over. This is what he said. Looking back at Mark chapter 10 again, just thinking about it here, Jesus was the Good Samaritan in this story. He was the Good Samaritan. Notice what happened when this man cried out. The others told him to keep his peace, but not Jesus. When the others charged him to shut up, Christ didn't. He didn't pass him by. He stopped and he had compassion on him because he recognized an unfulfilled need in this man. A man who was not producing as much as he was consuming, and probably wasn't much use to the big organization of society in that day. But Christ saw more than a pawn in this man. He was an individual, a man that had worth, a man that had potential. And notice that the blind man asked for his sight. He wasn't begging for money, for drink, or for food. I'm sure he had need of all those things, but he wanted to regain his sight, something that had been lost to him at some point in history, and Jesus obliged to restore something to him for mercy's sake. In his action, Christ not only showed the love and compassion that we should have for those in need, but I believe also showed something else. He shunned the socialist doctrine of a welfare state, providing a way for this man to now make a living and affirm the individuality of a man who was lost in a world ruled by the first communist. Brethren, Satan and his economy enslaves us into his collective and communistic philosophy, while God's economy frees us to individual expression, highlighting our uniqueness and freeing us to a true and everlasting prosperity. Your life and the government of your life is political, and I don't ever want you to forget that.